had the idea for this tour, I met with John Conforti, and he said, well, you got to talk to Tom Carpenter. And so I went and interviewed him, and he's the great-grandfather of William Pitt Carpenter. And I neglected to point out his headstone right at the entrance. The history that I've got seems to blend he and his father together, as best I can tell. So one or the other of them arrived in 1849, early on. I think it was the father, and I think he was a doctor. But there's no more evidence of a Dr. Carpenter that's of the appropriate age at that point. But the boy comes around, he goes to college, gets halfway through Oberlin College, and gets gold fever in '53, and comes around the Horn. That's pretty treacherous in that era. And goes to the Southern Mines, ends up over in Placerville on Spanish Hill. Takes his best day is $2,000 of nuggets out of Cedar Ravine in one day. And he goes on to become Justice of the Peace for 32 years here. Now, the story goes that he was, according to his great-grandson, who is now 90 and not in great health, so, you know, but the story goes that Judge Carpenter, as he was known, I can find no reference to him ever being elected to anything, but as Justice of the Peace, they used to call you Judge, as being very active, first off, a very active Democrat, which in that era, in the Civil War era, meant pro-slavery. Carpenter is supposedly a member of a leader, in fact, or the chairman of the Vigilance Committee. Do you guys know about the Vigilance Committees in the early going here, before we were a state, before there was any justice? It's how Hangtown got its name. Vigilantes. Vigilantism, and it was organized. There was committees. They didn't just randomly drag people out and hang them. They formed, they convened, somebody was made judge, I wonder who that might have been, and then there was some other, whoever showed up that day, was made jury, and they decided on the spot the fate of this person, and they executed that decision on the spot. Now, they didn't keep a lot of detailed records because they sort of figured once California became a state, I don't want to be associated with too much with all this stuff, because it was very litigious times. Everybody was suing everything. A lot of land use, unbelievable number of lawsuits. So they might have been reluctant to put their names on it, but there's not much written. And but Tom Carpenter, at 90, is just flat out adamant that his father didn't necessarily found it, but he was a member of it and a leader of it. And so I'm trying to research. I told you I'm not a researcher, but they're helping me out over at the archive at the fairgrounds, and we're not finding nothing. And finally, I come up with one recollection from his son, Bert, who was cleaning out his father's office after his father's death. His father died, I think, in 1916. It's on the headstone. He's cleaning out his father's office, and he finds some pretty interesting stuff. But the most interesting thing is a conch shell that was very specifically used to call the vigilantes out of the ravines and the hills when, in case of emergency, basically any type of emergency, but including the vigilante action. And they were the social order such as there was in that era. And so it's highly likely that Judge Carpenter was also a lead vigilante in his day, although it might have been his father, because we know that the good judge doesn't get here till the mid-50s. And that's pretty late for vigilantism. I don't know when the last act of vigilantism is, but it's right in there. I mean, cholera was rampant. You know, like 1 in 20 people, one year, 52, 1 in 20 people in Sacramento die of cholera. Think about it, 1 in 20, that's a lot. And a lot of those people get on stagecoaches. I mean, they haven't figured out that it's this bacteria caused from, you know, not having the outhouse far enough away from the kitchen. A lot of those people get on stagecoaches and just get out of here because everybody around here is dying and I'm not feeling so great myself. And so they get on stagecoaches and they come this way. Well, we have inns, and this is one of them, right along the wagon road. At every mile or so, there's an inn. I already talked about the toll roads. That's separate. Our toll road was right up under the freeway here. This was a 3-mile house, so named because it's 3 miles from Placerville. And so there's all these inns, and then each inn, if you look hard enough, there's always a cemetery. Lots of times there's burials outside the boundaries, and lots of times There were pauper graves, sometimes minorities, depending on the sentiment there. Although minorities are pretty well respected in the gold rush, except for eventually the Chinese got really shafted. But they didn't want to be buried with us anyway. But blacks, women of ill repute, poor people, all were ones that might not have had markers. I just pulled up one newspaper account of a guy that lived here at Smith Flat. And of course the newspapers of the day loved to write very flamboyantly. Barney O'Rourke, a well-known resident of Smith Flat, met with a horrible death on Tuesday night, the result of a drunken bent. He was so intoxicated that he was assisted home by neighbors who left him at the house door and admonished him not to build a fire or arise a light. Soon after entering the home, however, he lit a candle and was heard about the cabin for some time. In the middle of the night, the house was discovered to be in flames, and although the neighbors at once rushed to the premises, they were unable to save the unfortunate man, and he was roasted alive. On Wednesday morning, his body was taken from the ruins, and he was found to be terribly disfigured, one arm and both feet being burnt off. It is thought he let a candle fall into bedclothes, setting them afire, and thence the whole something caught. He was a native of Ireland. So lots of that. Lots of fire and liquor stories about death. When you're reading old obits, those two things, it's a recurring theme. And wagons and guns. Guns weren't that reliable. You could kill yourself shooting at something else, or you could just shoot yourself. They'd go off. You'd set it down and it would go off. And wagons, the roads are terrible, and they drove like bats out of hell. There's some great stories about that. But there was wagon accidents that were terrible, and they oftentimes didn't kill. They would just maim people, and it would take forever. Interestingly, Placerville was like a bastion of socialized medicine, an early shining light for a single-payer system. We've had good doctors and good hospitals here from the beginning. For reasons that I do not know, the gold rush attracted an inordinate number of physicians. In one of the most famous diaries, the Shirley diaries, the guy wants to go up to the Feather River, the upper reaches of the Feather River, and he's heard there's no doctor up there, that you're going to be welcomed, you're going to do great business, you're going to pan for gold on the side, and it's all going to be good. By the time he gets up there, there's 17 doctors living in this little town. And he's like, what? But Placerville did well. We had good doctors. We had a hospital within a year or two. It was right on Broadway in an old hotel. The industries that we were involved in this county were so dangerous and so remote. We were way off in the woods, we were way down in the ground when the thing happens. And so if you got hurt, you could bleed out, before one of these great doctors, before you were able to get to one of these great doctors. So there was lots of dying going on. And as I said earlier, one of the frustrating things is they had to be burying these people someplace. I mean, in the first couple of months of the gold rush, there's accounts of miners just that were on their own, being left, at the side of the stream. But right away they realized that they needed to form up in companies in order to block the river and form a channel and build a sluice box and do the things you needed to do to get gold out. It took more than one person a lot of times. And so you had a company. And one of the things that company did was bury you if you died. And so these people should be around here, and we just don't know where they're at. The back room was a powder room, and this was a place you could go to buy explosives. And that became an issue after Georgetown blew up. They passed a law that you couldn't just go selling explosives to any old buddy. And it turns out this is where all the stuff was coming from, down in the powder room where we're about to go. And we had a big fracas in the newspapers over that. But the front room, the main dining room, if you will, the main mine shaft went down there. And that was ground level at the time. So early on, they didn't think to move the dirt that far, and the whole area kind of built up and became the elevation that we're sitting at now. But originally, everything was a little bit lower. You see those big wheels sometimes associated with mines, those were tailing wheels used on the big, deep mines to move the dirt farther away from the hole so the hole didn't just keep getting deeper from the top. The big mines here were the Benfeld mine and the Carpenter mine. Carpenter as in old WP that I was talking about. He became quite prosperous with the Carpenter mine, which was right up there. It was just the other side of the freeway, but his land, actually it's hard to tell on the old maps, but either a Lyons or a Carpenter originally had the land that the cemetery is now on. So they did all right because there was a lot of gold down there. So this is the hole. So it's right down here. You note the water. Have you ever been down in the mine at Smith Flat? And I asked that of Tom Carpenter, and he lit up. Yes, I have, all the way to the end. Me and Fasadi went down there just to see what it was. Apparently they were still pumping it, and they spent a bunch of time and walked all the way to the end. It said it just went forever and ever, and then there was all branches of it, and they were making sure they didn't get lost. Wheeldon has tried to find the records. He's the master keeper of all the mining records in El Dorado County, and they don't know where all these mine shafts go. But they definitely connect to the American River Canyon. 3 shafts originally did. But feel free to look down there. And this is the powder room, so you had to have a safe place to store the powder. And that's what this was. So we have 3 types of structures along the wagon roads that really shaped our history. One are the way stations, like this. Another are the inns. This was like both, but many of them were just private inns, and there was more of those than anything. And it's interesting because a lot of our history that we have, the little scraps that we have left, are typically oriented around those inns. They become anchors for our knowledge of this prehistory, if you will, although it's not that far back. From the East Coast, like, you know, the 1840s and 50s were yesterday, but for us, it's prehistory. And there's just not much out there, but what there is often written at or about one of those inns. And it takes the form typically of diaries. The Victorians were great writers, and they wrote these flowery accounts that much of our knowledge of these places is now been extracted from. Of the old ones that survived to tell their stories in these books, you don't find any that were down in the mines. They might have been holding a pan for a little while in the early days, but then they got into some other business, and that's how they lived to be 70 or 80 or 90.